Hello and welcome to MalMakes, and welcome back to another episode of Intro to Painting, a step-by-step series for beginners. Today we're painting the background of Green Hill Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog, so grab your paints and paint along with me. Let's start by talking about materials. First, you're going to need something to paint on, and it could be paper or masonite or wood or any number of things if you're using acrylic, because it does dry pretty sturdy. And I have two things here that are a little bit more traditional. I have a canvas board, which is some sort of board that's covered in a canvas, and it's very thin, so it's easy to frame, it's easy to transport, it's lightweight. It has a lot of pros to it. It's a bit cheaper than an actual canvas, so if you're working on a budget, this is a great option for you. And the other thing I have back here is an actual stretched canvas, and it has a little bit of a give to it, unlike this one, which is pretty sturdy. And this is an 18 by 24. It's about 1.5 inches deep. I personally like the canvases that are a little bit deeper over here, just because it gives me a nice surface to work on. And I'm going to be doing the actual painting on the canvas, and I'm using this canvas board today to kind of show some different techniques, like different ways of painting clouds, and you can kind of choose which one you like best, or you can try them all and then choose which one works best for you. The second most important thing you need is paint, and I'm using a limited palette of 7 colors today. You could limit it further by doing 5. If you're looking to get into painting, Golden has a really great introductory set of 1-ounce tubes. So you get 6 colors and they're 1 ounces each, and it's all you need to get started. Now, they're not the exact colors I have here, but they'll basically work in place of it. So I have my 3 primary colors of cyan, yellow, and magenta. And I think they have like an ultramarine blue, a Hansa yellow, and like a naphtha red, which would work really great in place of these 3. They also have a white and a black, and I think these are the same colors that are in the set, titanium white and Mars black. So those 5. There's also a green in the set, and you could use that in place of the green we're going to be making today. But my other 2 colors are burnt umber and burnt sienna. And I'll show you how to make these out of the other 5 in case you don't want to buy them. It's pretty easy to make. I just have them, so I'm going to be using them. The next most important thing is paintbrushes, so I've picked out 4 of my favorites. If I could only do a painting with 4 brushes, it would probably be these 4. I like to have a big flat for things like the sky, a medium flat for things like clouds, mountains, and trees, a medium round for smaller details, and then a tiny round for even tinier details. But definitely try different brushes out, see what works well for you. Maybe a different size or a different shape. Maybe you prefer long handles to short handles. It's really about what you like to use. So maybe get a kit and try out the different shapes. There's like kits of 6 brushes that are all various sizes. But when you pick up paintbrushes, you definitely want to think about what the bristle is made from. So I have 2 number 4 fans right here. The one on the left is an acrylic brush, but it's very soft. Like you can see this, it's kind of just, my finger is pushing it all around, like it doesn't have any control. This is probably actually better for a watercolor painting because water isn't as heavy as a heavy body acrylic. And this is also an acrylic fan brush, but it has a lot more of a snap to it, where the brush is almost kind of pushing my finger back the other direction. So you know that this one's really going to push your paint around, and it's going to be a lot stronger. And now maybe you might want something like this in a fan, but like if I'm looking for a flat brush, I definitely want something that has really strong bristles. And finally, some miscellaneous things you need. Paper towel to clean up messes or to wipe paintbrushes down with. You'll want something to put your paint on to mix up colors. So I have this glass palette by Amico. I really love it, but I paint a lot, so it makes sense for me to have something like this. There's also plastic if you're not sure on the whole glass thing. And if you're not sure if you really want to get into this painting thing and spend a ton of money, you can always recycle. I use these containers all the time for water to wash off my paintbrushes with. And then you can just use the lid as a palette. It's nice and smooth. If it gets dirty and you can't clean off the acrylic paint, you can always just get a new one. So it's a really great option for that. And then speaking of mixing paint, you'll want something to mix the paint with. When you use a paintbrush, the paint gets in the bristles and into the metal part of the brush, and it's really hard to clean when you use it to mix your paint. So I like to use pallet knives. I really like this one with the bend in it because then my fingers aren't in the paint when I scoop with it. But there's a lot of different versions of these, and these are just the 2 I use all the time. But you could easily use a plastic spoon or a plastic knife. Just don't eat off of it when you're done. And then finally, you want something to draw a straight line with, so just a ruler or some sort of straight edge. I'm going to be using a T-square, and then you probably want a pencil just to draw your straight line, but I'm going to be using painter's tape, and this is just plain old frog tape I got at the store. And if you don't have this, you can just be super careful going along your edge. We finished talking about materials, so let's start talking about our picture. This is what I've sketched out for us to paint today, and I really like how it turned out, but there is some problems with it, and the reason I sketch things out is for two reasons. One, I use it like a map to see where things are going to go, so I can kind of picture it, and two, I do it just so I can see if anything's going to go wrong. For example, after I drew this, I liked how it turned out, but there's too much water. I think there should be more sky and just kind of move everything down. If I had just painted this straight on the canvas, I might have made that same mistake and not known it was going to turn out that way until it was done. So that's a really big part of why I sketch it. But for painting, we're going to be starting with our sky. We work furthest away to the closest to us. So the sky is the furthest. We'll start with that, and then the clouds, and then the far mountain range, the close bit of rocks here, the greenery, the waterfall, and then the water. So we're going to be working in layers, working all the way to our foreground. On my palette, I've put some cyan, titanium white, and then I put another puddle of titanium white. And in the smaller puddle, I took some of the cyan and mixed it in to make a light blue. And it's still a little bit too light, so I might take a little bit more of the cyan, and it's just a very little bit. You don't want to do too much, and mix that into this color over here. And I'm just trying to make it cohesive so there's no streaks of the other color, so it all looks the same. And then I'll kind of wipe off my palette knife, scrape all of these pieces together so I have a nice little puddle of it. And then this will be my base color for painting, this light blue I've made. On this test board, I'm just going to kind of show you different ways to do things before I do it on the actual canvas. Because I'm going to do things in a few different ways, you can kind of pick and choose which ones you like best. And this is where I'm going to show you all of that today. So I'm starting by putting down some of that light cyan mix I mixed with the titanium white, and I'm putting it a bit more solid across the top, just filling it all the way in. And then I'm going to bring it down the canvas. I'm just going to feather it lightly. It's not going to be solid like it is up top. I might go back up here and just kind of make this part up here more solid. Once I'm happy with it looking like this, I'm going to grab some titanium white and start at the bottom and go all the way across and then bring that up. And if I'm working fast enough, my colors should blend together nicely here on the canvas. So you can see the white is kind of turning into a lighter blue, which is exactly what I want. And I'm just going to keep bringing this up into the light blue as I go. I might go all the way up and grab some of this to bring it down. And I'm just trying to go back and forth until I'm happy with the gradient between the two. I've also found that doing a little bit of a wiggle right in between where I can't seem to get them to blend well is a good strategy for mixing the colors. And then once you kind of have it down, just going back and forth to get rid of the brush marks. Now you can make this transition as smooth or as rough as you want. I could have left some of the streaks of white in there to look like faraway clouds, and that would have worked out really well too, but I decided to show you how smooth you can get it. I could even go a little bit smoother with it because there's a little bit of darkness up here, but there's lots of things you can try with this. You could do two paintings and see which one you like better, but I'm sticking with this for this practice board here. And then I'm going to switch to another flat brush, in fact the one I showed you earlier, and I'm just going to grab some white paint. Just some little bit of titanium white paint here on the tip of the brush. Not a whole lot, just getting it on the tip of the bristles. Now on the right side, I'm going to do this wet on wet for the clouds, where I have a wet background and wet paint and I'm putting the clouds on it. And I'm just going to kind of set it down and just kind of swirl some clouds in, using the little bit of white that's here on my brush. And I'm just trying to make these puffy shapes with the clouds and then just kind of brush the bottoms down like this. So I can grab some more titanium white if it's getting too light blue, and maybe do another one over here. The great thing about this technique is it starts to produce some really realistic clouds. Like some of these down here are starting to turn out really nice. But one of the hard things is when your paint is so wet, your clouds start to turn into this light blue, so you have to keep adding more and more titanium white to it. Now, the lighter your base color it is, the easier it is to not have to worry about that, but it still happens. So I'm just going to keep adding more white to this until some of these tips of these clouds get a little lighter instead of so blue. But you'll notice that some of my top clouds are bigger and then the faraway ones are smaller. So I have the bigger ones up close here and then the smaller ones down here towards the horizon. And I'm not 100% sure like where the cliff is going to go yet, but it's best off to work pretty far down because I can always cover up this. It's easier to cover up than it is to try and remix colors and paint in small areas. And I'm leaving this half to dry to do the other cloud technique. When you're doing clouds this way, sometimes it's really hard to make sure that your clouds are staying white, and I found that if you let it dry for like 4 minutes tops and then go back to it, it kind of helps keep the white paint from blending in so much because everything underneath is a little bit more tacky and a little bit dry. You can also kind of like blot in the cloud with the corner of a flat brush. So I'm just picking up some more titanium white and kind of tapping it in a little bit. That kind of helps the color stay bright too. And don't forget about the middle of the clouds. You don't want those to be darker. You want those to also have some ridges and texture. And then towards the bottom, I'm just kind of going back and forth, just streaking the paint down there, blending it into the background color. This side was drying while I did this side, and I'm trying something different over here. So I have a light blue, which was my light cyan with more titanium white, and I'm doing the same sorts of sizes and kind of shapes as the right side, where they're a little bit bigger towards the top, a little bit smaller towards the horizon line, but instead of doing like a flat bottom, I'm doing like a puffy bottom of the cloud. It's not straight across. And I'm just tapping these in, just kind of like I did the other one. You can't really see the ones down here, but they're there. So once this dries, I'm going to do the same thing on top with pure titanium white, but not go all the way to the edges, because in-game the clouds are kind of like a lighter blue underneath, but then they have like this secondary cloud on top in titanium white. I've given it a few minutes and these are dry, so now I'm just going to take some of the titanium white, and with it being dry it's not going to blend in as much, and I'm just going to kind of lighten up the middle parts of these clouds. There's good things about doing clouds both ways. The ones on the left are nice and soft. They have this more of a realistic feel to them to me, whereas the ones on the right have more of an painterly, stylistic feel to them. And I think I'm going to go more for realism with the rest of the painting, so I'm going to be doing my clouds this way. But if you wanted to go a little bit more abstract, a bit more stylistic, you might want to go with clouds like this. So I'm going to switch from this back to my canvas and we'll start doing the gradient again. I've let this dry so that when I start doing the clouds with this technique, they don't mix in like the wet and wet. And I still did the gradient on here and it looks really nice and smooth. And for the color, my base color for these clouds is a lighter cyan titanium white mix. So you can kind of see that against the top color here. It's like somewhere in between more of one of these colors. And as I move down to the bottom of the horizon where the clouds are going to get smaller, you really won't see this, but that's totally fine because when I move to the titanium white on top of this, that'll definitely show up on top of this light blue. And once I have this kind of light blue base down, I'm taking some titanium white on the same brush and just tapping it in, trying to stay like inside the border of the other cloud, but also trying to blend it together so I don't have this very obvious line around the edge. These small clouds toward the horizon, I didn't end up putting any of the light blue on those just because you weren't seeing any of it at all. So I'm just taking a little bit of plain titanium white, and maybe here I'll do a medium-sized cloud. Just kind of topping in the top and just kind of scrubbing in the bottom a little bit, just to kind of make it blend towards the bottom. And you'll notice, like I said, these ones are a little bit bigger, sort of in this row, and then they get real tiny towards the bottom. And I know I mentioned it earlier, I don't know exactly where this hill is going to go, but it's better safe than sorry to fill in some of these clouds, because I'd rather not have to repaint things, and it's just best to paint them ahead of time anyway. I wanted to show you what it looks like if you use too much paint, because that's something that's very easy to do. So in my sketchbook I did a small gradient, and then I used too much paint to make a cloud. And it starts to look kind of like a cloud done like this, but just in paint form. So if you notice that happening, you should be starting with smaller clouds. Like when I did this one, you kind of want to start smaller, and you can always extend it a little bit bigger if you need to. If you start too big, you're going to end up with a massive cloud if you have to fix it. So with too much paint here on my brush, I'm just going to kind of wipe some of it off on a paper towel, so there's not that much. And then I can go back on top of this cloud and kind of just spread out what's here. The same with this one. I can just kind of move this around to give it a softer edge. And then if I notice there's some areas where it's picked up too much of the paint, you can kind of see this edge of where the paint used to be. You can grab just a little bit more wet paint for the white and just kind of fill that in, being very careful not to use too much. Now when you do this, you do want to work quick, because if your paint is dried, it's a lot harder to fix. And if it's dried a little bit, I might suggest adding a little bit more of the blue to your brush and kind of going over it with the blue to kind of mask some of it. So you feather it with the light blue, kind of hiding that white cloud that was in the background, and then just grabbing more titanium white after the blue is dried and just touching up inside of it with a little bit more titanium white. I find that this is a problem I personally struggle with. I'm just using too much paint on my brush when I do clouds, but definitely make sure you're wiping your brush off on the palette or some paper towel or a piece of paper or something. It's easier to add, it's harder to subtract with paint. So definitely do that, and if you're still struggling, consider adding a stiffer brush. Now this is an extra firm filament on the Simply Simmons brush. They're more of like a dark red color if you're looking for brushes. I really like these. But if you're having trouble finding something that has a good snap to it, maybe consider a bristle brush for oil paints. They have a good snap, and their bristles are a bit rougher, I think, especially this one. I've had it a long time. So it's pretty good for tapping in clouds. Going back to my sketch, you can see my next layer is this faraway mountain range, and I am going to be blocking it in with a chalk pastel pencil. I'm using this gray because normally I like to use white because it erases pretty cleanly, but it's not going to show up on this light blue, so I'm using a gray. And I didn't list this in the materials you need, so if you have one, great, you can use it. If not, a pencil will work. Just be really careful because it's hard to erase on top of paint. And if you're using a light color and you do pencil underneath, you'll see it through the paint. But we will be doing a pretty dark color, so it should work out in this particular instance. I'm going to move this here while I'm drawing, just so I can kind of see what the plan was to put it here on the canvas. And if I think about halfway down is right about where I had put the water, and I had wanted to kind of move it down in the final painting, so if I kind of think about scooching everything down a little bit, this starts in like the top third of the piece. So right about maybe here is where this should start. when I'm drawing these, I'm trying to vary it up. Like, I'm not trying to make them all the same height, or the bottom part, I'm not putting those all across the line. I'm varying up where they go, how tall they are in comparison to the one next to them, if they have these ridges or not, and how many ridges, and do both sides have ridges. So I'm just trying to make it organic and not the exact all the way across. In some areas I might go real short and come down to here, and some I might go up a bit taller. So it's all about keeping it random. And if you're using chalk pastel, you can erase with a damp towel just to like change stuff. If you notice like these ones all start to get the same, you can just erase it and redraw it. I'm also going to move back to the canvas board and do the same thing, just to try out some colors and just two different techniques again to see which one I like best. I started to realize when I did the canvas board before with the sky that I really shouldn't have my actual canvas behind it, just because I don't want to get paint on it that's not the right color in the right spot, so I'm just going to move it out of the way so I can focus on the canvas board for my tests. This is the part of the painting where I'm going to need those brown colors, the burnt umber and the burnt sienna, to do this mountain range and then the next mountain range. So in my sketchbook, I did a swatch of burnt sienna and a swatch of burnt umber to show you the actual color out of the tube, and I'm going to show you how to make it in case you didn't want to get those extra tubes of paint. So on my palette here, this is the burnt sienna and the burnt umber is the darker one over here. And I'm going to start by mixing an orange. I took some primary yellow and some magenta to make this orange. And it's looking a little bit too yellow. I want it to be a bit more orange, so I'm going to take a little bit more magenta and mix it into this. And that's looking more like I want. Burnt sienna is very orange compared to burnt umber, which is a little bit more neutral. So I'm just going to start by making that orange. So once I have a uniformly mixed orange, I'm going to take just a little bit of blue, like very little bit on my palette knife, and mix it in. And I'm using blue because orange is across from the color wheel of blue. So it's going to make it more neutral, and it makes browns when you do that. So like red's complement is green, and it's across from each other on the color wheel. So if you add green to red, it'll make a brown too. It'll just look a little bit different. But I'm using orange in this case because the sienna is so orange. I can grab a little bit more blue if I need to. You can very quickly add too much, so you have to be careful. Otherwise it'll go way too blue too fast. So here I've gone and added way too much blue. It's starting to look more of a blue-brown instead of an orange-brown. So over here I'm going to grab more yellow and more red and mix up another orange so I can use that to put back into the brown that I messed up. And again, I don't want to add too much, otherwise I'll be adding more blue again. So that's looking like a pretty nice brown. Let's compare it to our burnt sienna on our piece of paper. So I'm just going to get a clean brush and grab a little bit of this color and put it here on the paper. You can see right off the bat, it's kind of yellow actually, compared to the burnt sienna. So if that's the case, I might take a little bit more magenta and not an orange and mix that into the brown I have. So again, I'm only mixing small amounts of magenta into that brown because it can very quickly turn into just basically a magenta. So I've added little bits until I thought it was a bit warmer, and I'll come back here to the paper and do another test. And that's looking a lot closer. It's a lot more red compared to this yellow one, but it's still a bit light in my opinion compared to the burnt sienna. It's definitely closer. So right now I think maybe I should add a little bit of blue-green, and I'm adding blue-green just because this is more red now, and red's opposite is green and orange's opposite is blue, so if I mix them together I get blue-green. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of a blue-green with this and then just put a little bit of it into this brown. So let's test this on the paper now. Just gonna grab a little bit of this new color, put that back down. I think it's darker than this one, but it's gone a little bit more yellow again, where I need to add some more magenta. I think this color is pretty close. It's a little bit lighter than burnt sienna. If I take some of this new color and go on top of my swatch, you can see it is lighter, but it's a really nice warm brown. I can darken it up with a little bit of Mars Black, which I have right here. Just grab very little amount, you don't want to add too much, and just darken this a little bit. And I think that's it. After I added some Mars Black, it got a little bit too light again, and it wasn't red enough anymore, so I did add more magenta to make this color. But I think that's pretty close to my burnt sienna. I'm just gonna wipe this brush down with a lot of this paint. And grab a little bit of this burnt sienna to test right here. I think those two are pretty close. So you can see it does take a little bit to make colors like this, but you definitely learn a lot about color mixing when you do that. So you can see like this one I had originally made was too yellow, and this was closer, but it wasn't dark enough, so you have to add more complements when you do that. And so I added the complements, and it got a little bit too yellow again, so then I had to add more red, and then I added some Mars Black to darken it up just a little bit. And then I got the color that I was looking for. So that's very close to the burnt sienna. You kind of have to go back and forth and test it like this until you're happy with the color you get. Now, you could have been happy with this color and that would have been totally fine to paint this with. But when you're trying to match things exactly, you have to think about going back and forth and testing it against your sample first. Next, I'm making the burnt umber. So I have this color that's pretty close to burnt sienna, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more Mars Black. You can see like the ratio I'm using here. It's a very small amount of paint. And black is very overwhelming, whether you're using carbon black or Mars Black, so you need to go slow. I was always taught to use my lightest color and mix darker colors into it. For example, if I was making green out of yellow and blue, I would start with yellow and add small amounts of blue because blue is the darker color. In this case, the brown is the lighter color and the black is the darker color, so I'm starting with a lot of the base color and a small amount of the dark color. So that's already looking pretty dark, so I'm going to grab my paintbrush and I'm going to test it against this swatch here. So it's looking a little bit lighter than my burnt umber, and it's looking a little bit red to me, or orange, so I might just add a touch of this blue-green in. Not too much, just to kind of neutralize that color a little bit, because burnt umber isn't as warm as burnt sienna. I think that's pretty close. All I had to do was tone down the neutralness of the fake burnt sienna I made with the complements, which was this blue-green, and then I just darkened it up with more of the Mars Black, and I think it's really close to the burnt umber. So let's paint on top of the swatch to see. It's a little bit lighter, I think, but it's really close, and it would work just as well as burnt umber. So you can totally make burnt umber and burnt sienna using the limited color palette, and just mixing up your browns. And it's a really great learning exercise, and it's actually kind of fun to try and see how many different browns you can make by mixing complementary colors. You can either print or get your own color wheel to sort of see where colors are in the color wheel, but you just want to start mixing complements, like red and green are straight across from each other. So you could try taking lots of green with a little bit of red and seeing what brown it makes. You could try a lot of red with a little green and see what brown it makes, and do that all the way around the color wheel to see what you can get and see how many browns you can make using only your 5 colors. Anyway, going back to the actual painting, I will be using burnt umber and burnt sienna just to save some time. I'm going to fill in this entire mountain range with burnt sienna. Even for both techniques, I'm going to fill this in with burnt sienna and let it dry. And I'm making sure I really fill in these mountain ranges. I don't want to see any of these chalk lines that I have. Just like if you were using pencil, you definitely want to fill in and go over your pencil line a little bit so it doesn't show. And it's a really great thing that if you mess up a little bit, you can just kind of fix it. So like if I accidentally paint too high here, I'm like, oh no, I painted over my line. It's really great because it is so random how we drew it. We can just bring this new mountain in here and just maybe bring this one up a little bit taller. Maybe it'll run into this one here. So it's really great that you can just kind of make it up as you go. And you could just paint it without doing any of the chalk, but I like to do the chalk because it gives me a good idea of like where things are and what I've already done. And I can fix it before I even get started if I've drawn it and I don't like it. But I'm just going to keep filling this in, making sure I cover up all my chalk lines. And then towards the bottom, I'm just going to feather this so I don't have any ridges of paint sticking up. I'm switching back to the canvas board, and on the left I'm going to be doing this first technique and the right will be the second one. So the first thing I'm going to do over here is I've mixed up an orange, and it's not just any orange. It's similar to how I showed you how I made the burnt sienna earlier. I made up an orange with yellow and red, and then I just put a little bit of the brown in it. But as you learned, you can use blue in place of that because blue is opposite orange. And I just had some of the burnt sienna still on my palette from doing this. So you could just add a little bit of blue or just a little bit more of the burnt sienna to make this kind of muddier orange. It's just not super bright. And I'm going to kind of just highlight all of the edges of the mountains here and give it some texture. So I'm just kind of painting the very left side of all of these and then just bringing it back like it's rocks showing through. Now obviously when I first put the brush down on the edge, there's going to be more paint, so it's going to be a bit more opaque. And then as I bring it to the right, it's just going to naturally run out of paint on the brush. So it's going to get a bit more transparent and show the burnt sienna underneath. You can definitely see the split right here. On the left, I thought about the sun being over here and kind of just hitting all of these edges of these mountains. Over here, I thought about the sun kind of being out here and kind of hitting the main body of it. Now this is how it tends to look a bit more in the game, and over here is kind of how I picture mountains to look like in a more realistic sense. So I'm going to mix up my next color, which is yellow, and it's going to be more of a yellow-orange, super saturated, not as muted as this orange, just to apply an even brighter highlight on these. This new color is made with only yellow and magenta, and it's mostly yellow. And I'm just taking a little bit on my paintbrush and going over these orange parts that I had and just brightening them up a little bit. And I'm not trying to cover them completely. I want to see both colors. It's just to give it a little bit more texture and a bit more color. I'm doing the same thing on the right. I'm just using more of this color because there's more of the base orange that I can go on top of and not cover. And I'm doing the same idea. I'm going right along the edge of the highlight and then just bringing down some of this lighter color. And lastly, for both sides, I'm going to be using the burnt umber, and that's that dark brown I made earlier. And on the left side, it's a little bit easier because I can put it right on the left side of all of these mountains and just kind of feather it in towards the right side. I can also go on the tops of these parts and just define the shadow a little bit by making it slightly darker. As I get towards the right side of each mountain, I'm just starting to fill it in with more burnt umber just to give it a shadow and to blend it down into this, which is going to be burnt umber in the end. Towards the bottom, I'm just switching to a bigger brush, just because it's easier than using a tiny brush to fill such a big area. And as I get towards the top here, I'm just going to kind of try and blend it in with what I did and make it look a little bit more random and scratchy than just solid burnt umber. On the right, it's a little bit harder to add the dark color, just because the light kind of flows this way, so I really have to think about it, and I definitely need it to go to the burnt umber. So if I start to like bring it up in the same sort of direction, I can start to kind of bring in a little bit of these mountain ridges. And then with a small brush, I can just kind of scrub in a little bit of this. And on the bottom of each of these, it would be where the highlight is, so I want to keep that nice and clean, not so soft and fuzzy. So on the top of each of these lines is where I'm going to kind of feather it out with more of a dry brush. I've been adding my burnt umber kind of on the middle of all the cliffs, like to the right of the highlight, and I'm realizing that all of these diagonal lines that lead up to these mountains don't look natural at all. They kind of look like straight diagonal lines. So I'm kind of following this edge right here and just trying to make it look a bit more natural and a bit more like rock or a mountain texture. I can even go back into the lighter colors like the muted orange I had and just kind of continue some of this down into here a little bit. I've put the canvas back, but I wanted to talk about my decision for what I'm going to be doing on the canvas. The left side is more like the game because there's less bright colors and more dark. The right definitely does look like mountains, so I am happy with both, but in this case I think I'm going to go with these just because it feels a little bit closer to how the game looks. So like in the test, I'm starting with this muddy orange color where I made an orange out of yellow and magenta, and then just put a little bit of cyan into it, or you could put some burnt sienna. Either works pretty good. You just want something to be kind of a muddy orange. So I'm using this to add highlights to all of these mountains. And I'm going to start over here on the left because I'm right-handed, and I'm just going to lay some of this down right on the edge of each of these mountains. And I'm going to try to stay within the burnt sienna color and not go onto the sky. And if I do, it's not a big deal. I'll just try and grab some extra paint so it's opaque at least and not sloppy. And then once I lay the paint down along the whole edge, I'm going to kind of try and make this ridge and just keep painting until there's no paint on the brush, just to kind of feather it out as I get this way. And then I'll pick up some more paint and go on to the next edge, which is this one up here, and I'm going to go all the way to the tip of the mountain and pretty close down to this one, and I'm just going to feather this as well. And if I need to, I can always wipe off my brush a little bit so there's not as much paint on it. And that way it kind of naturally feathers like it did down here, but on top of the mountain. And then these ones on the right are, I think, the toughest part, just to show a highlight for them. So I'm just going to put a little bit on the tip of it and just bring it a little bit to the right. And it's harder to see on this side just because the paint's a little transparent, So I may need to do a few layers where I lay down more on top, just to brighten it up to make sure we see that orange color. As I'm laying down the paint, I'm trying to clean up some of my edges. You can see like some of the lines here aren't nice and smooth. Some of them are real nice, like this one's real nice. But as I'm doing this, I'm trying to clean it up. So when I lay down the orange, I may need to push it a little bit further than where the burnt sienna was just to clean up that line. And I'm just still doing the same thing where I bring the orange back and let it feather out naturally. And if you find you just have way too much paint on your brush, just like you did the clouds, like get some of it off on the palette so you have very little to kind of just feather this paint into the canvas. Once the orange is dry, I'm just grabbing a little bit of that saturated yellow orange I have, and I'm putting it along the edge of each of these, like on the left. Not all the way down, just kind of most of the way down, and then along the top part of these little ridges I've made. And then I'm getting rid of any extra paint on my brush and just feathering it into the orange. I'm not trying to cover up all of the orange, just add a little bit of highlights to some of it. Each of these colors have gotten 2 coats. So I did 2 coats of the orange and then 2 coats of the yellow orange, just to make sure it was bright enough on top of this burnt sienna. I wanted to make sure it would show through. So it did take 2 coats to do that. But to finish it up, I'm going to go back to this for a second. And the last thing I have to do for these mountains is to take the burnt umber and go along the bottom and then start to bring it up into this a little bit so I can blend it down into the darkness. Going back to the canvas board and the sketch, our next row is this middle one. Now I'm ignoring the trees for now because I can just kind of put them wherever I want. I don't have to think about it too much. I do need to consider where I want the waterfall to go, so I will be sketching that in too. And I'm going to be using a chalk pastel again, but this one's white because I'll be able to see it on top of the burnt umber. And I'm trying to keep it natural still and organic, like the tops of all of these lines. I don't want it to be a pattern. And again, I'm going to switch back to the canvas so I can do the same thing in chalk. While I'm working on this, I'm going to draw in the bottom line here just so I can think about how big this needs to be. And I'm using a T-square squared off with the edge of the canvas just to make sure I have a nice straight line. But if you were using a ruler, I would definitely measure down. So you can start from the top and measure down to where you want the water to go, which is in my case 12¼ inches. And then you would just make a little mark, come over to the other side of the canvas and measure down the same measurement, 12¼ inches, and make a mark. And then because you don't have this here, you would just take both of your lines, line them up with your ruler, and then draw a straight line across. You always want to measure on both sides when you're trying to make something level, because if you just measure on one, you're liable to kind of put your ruler like this and draw yourself a crooked line. So make sure you measure so you can make sure it's exactly parallel to the bottom. Just like the faraway rocks, I'm going to prime these in burnt sienna first, and even though I drew this line here, I'm just going to feather it down past the line. If I don't do that and I just draw myself a straight paint line, there'll be an actual line in the paint that you can feel, and it's kind of off-putting to me when I have those. I try and avoid doing that, so I'm just going to bring it at least to the line and then feather it down from there. As for the waterfall, I'm just going to go right where it meets, right here, and just come straight down with the burnt sienna. The waterfall will be covering some of that burnt sienna later, but I don't know exactly how much yet. I just kind of drew these lines in roughly just to give myself an idea of how it's going to look. The difference of the burnt sienna over the burnt umber versus the raw canvas is really obvious. You can definitely see there's a change between this and this. So I'm going to give it a second coat of paint before I move on to doing the texture. I took a chalk pastel and drew in some details for these rocks to help myself sort of see where all of the layers are going to go. Now on these two I did the same thing where they all kind of just cascade down on the right side of the rocks. This is kind of how the sprites look in the game for the background, so I wanted to try it out, and I'm going to be using the same colors I have back here, but there's going to be a lot more light tones instead of so much dark tones with all the burnt umber. Now in the middle I went a little bit different. I kind of thought about having all of these different layers to show kind of just the rocks building out from this wall face. And just like these, it's going to have all of these same colors but less dark. I just wanted to try doing a little bit of a different pattern to show a little bit different shapes. And again, starting with the muddy orange, I'm going to be adding the highlights first. This middle layer has a lot of different things done to it for me to test out. Now from here to the left there's a lot more of the light tones than there are the mid-tones, and on the right side there's more of the mid-tone, which is the burnt sienna. And on the outside I have more of these cascading rocks, where in the middle I have a lot more of the center rocks that kind of just fill up the space. And I really like little bits and pieces of everything, so it'd be really hard to just kind of choose one and go with it. So I think I'm actually going to kind of take everything and mix it all together to do on the actual canvas. So here on the actual canvas, I'm just going to go ahead and take the chalk pastel again and start to mark in these rocks, taking a little bit of everything, like the cascading rocks coming down and layering on top of each other, but then a few of the ones that fill up the middle part. To apply the color, I'm still doing it like I did up here, where the light is kind of hitting from off on the left. So if each of these lines is kind of like the right side of the rock face, it's going to catch the light on the top left first, and kind of stretch across, and everything else is going to cast a shadow on it, so it's going to get the highlight on the right here. So I'm just shading all the top, and then along my chalk mark for each one. And then I'm just going to kind of fade it into the burnt sienna. I think I've done too much of the orange color, so I'm just going to take some burnt sienna on a brush and kind of tone it back a little bit by doing the same sort of like dry brushing technique, but starting in the burnt sienna and going into the orange. In order to get the waterfall perfectly symmetrical, I made myself a tracer. So this measurement is just the same height of the waterfall to the bottom of the water here. And then I just kind of curved it coming down this way and then sloped it out at the bottom. This part here is completely straight. It just kind of curves in at the top and curves out at the bottom. So then I could go on the rock that you can see the last bit of here and just lined up that point with the very right side of that rock, and then lined it up with the bottom line I have for the water, and then just traced it going down. And then for the other side, all I did was flip it, found that same point where this line hits that first rock, lined it up, and then just traced it on the right side. That way it's the same on both because I'm using the same tracer. And then I just did the same thing over here. And then in order to add texture, I'm going to be using white just to prime it one solid color. Because this is so dark and my blue is actually pretty transparent, adding the white first is really going to help me show all of the blue and the white colors through. Of course I'm doing both of these different on the canvas board to show you two different ways, but they're both going to be filled in with cyan first. I'm waiting on the canvas board to dry before I apply any of the water texture, so I've gone over to the actual canvas and blocked in where the waterfall is going to go, and I'm going to tape off the water line right here with the painter's tape. And once I get here, I'm just going to be really careful just to kind of keep it a straight line, and then I'll just have to paint very carefully to connect the two. I have a few tips for the painter's tape that I've learned and has definitely helped me out. I start by putting one corner in and just kind of like holding it with my fingernail, and then I'll take the tape from down here and kind of wiggle it away from the canvas, and then I'll kind of move my finger to another spot and just kind of press it right where I want it to go. All the time kind of wiggling over here, trying to make sure it's perfectly lined up and the tape hasn't curved any. And then I'll move my finger and I'll get ready to push it here and I'll wiggle it till it's straight, and then I'll just push it when it gets to be in the right spot. And I'll go all the way across like that, so I've only kind of pushed in a few places. And then I'll just take like my fingernail and I'll scratch at the very edge here to make a good seal. Otherwise my paint's going to leak underneath, and then I'll have to do some touch-up work with my rock colors to fix it later. And I don't want to have to do that, so I just kind of scrape it like this along the edge where I'm painting. And you can actually kind of see when I do that where it adheres really good, and that's just it sticking. That's not anything else. Personally, I haven't had any trouble peeling up the tape with and it taking the paint with it. Now, if you're someone who adds water to your paints, or if you're maybe using a lower quality paint, like not golden or not Liquitex heavy body, you may notice that happening. You may want to do some tests first in a sketchbook or something just to see if it does happen to you. But there's other products you can buy. This Frog Tape company also makes one for delicate surfaces, and I'm pretty sure it's yellow in color. That might be something you want to try that may not do that for a different paint or a glaze. Scotch makes this artist tape, and I've tried it and it works pretty much the same as this green tape, but this is easier to get because I just got it at Walmart or Home Depot. So that's some things you can try. Also, try not to add water to your acrylic paints. What happens is there's a binder in the paint that sticks it to each other and sticks it to the canvas, and like it holds on to things when it dries. If you add water, it kind of spreads that out in the paint, so it doesn't have like a tighter bond. It'll have a looser bond. So if you put tape down, it may kind of break that when you peel it up. So try not to do that, and if you're someone who really wants to like thin a paint down so you can do glazing, I suggest getting some media like acrylic glazing liquid, because this will still help it bind to the canvas and to each other, but it'll help make your paints more transparent. The water on the canvas I filled in white, and then on the canvas board this blue is still drying. In the meantime, I thought we'd work on the greenery, the trees or bushes or whatever they are on these rocks. So first we need to make a green. On my palette I have cyan and I have some primary yellow over here, and I'm going to be mixing this yellow into the blue. And it's probably going to take more yellow than I have here, but this is essentially how we're going to make it. We're just going to take kind of equal amounts of both colors and mix it together to make a green. Now I'm looking for a darker green, something more like the one that I have here. If it's too yellow green, I'll have to add more blue, and if it was too indigo, I'd have to add more yellow. But this looks like a pretty good dark green that I was looking for. And the problem is because the yellow is in it, it's very transparent, and I really want it to be a little bit more opaque. And it could be a little bit darker, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of Mars Black up here, and it's just very, very little. That might even be too much, and I'll mix that into the green to make it slightly darker. And this is going to be my base layer for the green. I really don't need to mark these in, but I think it would be easier to show you if I did. So I drew some of the big ones, and I thought about how they would kind of rest on these edges. And I think I really just want to have a few overlaps, so I might make this one a bit bigger. So there's a few overlapping here. And then I have some small ones just to kind of show some space and some size changes. Maybe we'll put one here. And that's kind of going to be it. On the actual canvas I have a little bit more rock space, so I'll be putting some more, but on this it's kind of smaller, so I don't have a whole lot of space. And I'm going to be using a bigger round for this, and getting some of this darker green color I had, and just going right on top of this and tapping it in. I'm not trying to fill in a perfect circle, that's why I'm not just doing this, and I'm tapping it in. I want to have all of these little areas that kind of stick out and look like individual leaves. I'm kind of thinking this green isn't dark enough, so I mixed up an even darker green by adding more blue and more black to this color that I had. And I'm just going to tap on top of it a little bit to bring in some of this dark color. Almost like I was repainting it, but I don't need to cover all of it. I just kind of want to fill in the center. Next I'm going back to this base green, and I'm going back over the dark. I don't want to cover it completely because I do want some of that dark showing in there, but I kind of want to hide the edges and then just put a few of these tapped in leaves on top of it. For the next layer, I took that same base green that I made and I added a little bit more yellow and a little bit of white just to lighten it up. And then I'm just going to tap in some of these highlights and just kind of keep them on the parts that are getting hit by the sun. I can continue adding layers this way by mixing up lighter and lighter greens and just tapping in a little bit where these highlights are. Now, just like the clouds, you don't want too much paint on your brush. So if you're not finding that you're getting these tiny little dots, even with a big brush like this, you can always wipe off your brush on a paper towel to get rid of some of that extra paint, and then just go back in and tap very lightly. Once I finished the ones here along the bottom, I decided I wanted one more. And instead of starting with the base color, working dark, working back to the middle, and then working towards the light end, I started with the dark, and it started a bit smaller, and then the next color it grew a little bit, and then the mid-tone it grew a little bit more, and then the light colors I just kind of concentrated on the left, and they're all the light colors are kind of on the upper left, just because if we're still thinking about our sun being over here, that's the part that's going to get illuminated by the sun. So I'm happy with how these turned out, but they kind of look like they're floating, like they don't look like they're sitting in the rocks. So I'm going to take some of this burnt umber and burnt sienna colors and just do a little bit of shading around their base. There's going to be a few I put along the water line, but I can't do that until this tape is peeled off, and I'm not going to do that until this blue is dry and I do the texture of the water. I'm back to the canvas board to work on the waterfalls. On the left, I'm going to try and make it look more like the game where there's these like repeating scalloped edges and zigzagging patterns, but on the right, I'm going to go for more of a realistic waterfall. And I'm using the light blue that I had from the sky, some more titanium white, and then more of the cyan if I need to darken it up. My technique on the left side is just using different variations of white all the way to cyan, like different mixtures of those two colors. And I'm starting to fill it in with this scratchy vertical motion. So like if I start here, I'm going back and forth so both edges are kind of scratchy. And I'm doing this zigzag that goes horizontally across this waterfall part. And I'm just going up and down with the brush and kind of going lower and then higher, and then maybe just brightening up some of the areas where the paint didn't quite go. But I'm trying to have all of these zigzags look like they're moving downwards, like the tips of waves coming down this waterfall. This started off as a very jumbled mess, just because none of these lines were really cemented in how I wanted them to go. They were kind of all over, overlapping, crisscrossing, and doing all sorts of crazy things. But I found that once I picked a color and started to apply it all the way across the waterfall in one continuous thing, instead of like a half here and a half here, it really sort of brought it all together. So I'm just going to take some titanium white and do a small one on the very tips of all of these light colors. The right is going to be a little bit more realistic, so I wanted to point out how I'm doing some of these colors that are in here. So in the sketchbook, I'm just going to do a small value scale with titanium white and cyan, because everything in here and the one on the right is going to be a mix of those two colors. So if I start with cyan here on the left, and then just kind of bring it to the right and let the brush naturally run out of paint and kind of feather onto the paper. I might need some more over here, and then just do the same thing. So I have like a small, quick value scale of that. So I'm going to grab some titanium white and start on the right, and then work my way left. So you'll see that I have a nice light blue over here, and as it gets into the cyan, it starts to get darker until I have pure cyan by itself. And sometimes you have to go back and forth when you do this with acrylics, just because some things are a little bit drier, some things I've gotten a little bit more wet or more paint. So everything in the waterfall is contained in this value scale. I have a little bit of all of these different light blues, and it's just the two colors. It's cyan and titanium white. So like on my palette when I do this, I have those two colors by themselves. I do like a 50-50 mix to make a mid blue. And then I also have this light blue, and then if I want, I can take some of this and just like put it over here and mix some more cyan to make it darker. I could add more titanium white to the light blue to make it lighter. So I kind of just keep working this way. Like if I want a darker color, I might mix one up. If I want something light, I might mix that up. Or I could take something that's already here. So that's just kind of how I started picking colors and doing this real quickly. And it's just these two colors mixed together, and you get a nice variety of blues you can use. But for the right one, I'm going to start with titanium white towards the top of the waterfall. And I'm going to lay that down, just coming down and following the flow of the water. And then I'm going to take a lighter blue and do the same thing right underneath, but maybe bring it a little further down. And if I cover up some of the titanium white, that's fine. I can just add in more later. But I'm trying to bring this a bit further down to show the water kind of flowing down this waterfall. I probably should have started with the darker colors and worked towards the light, because it's looking like I'm going to have to probably redo all of the light colors anyway. But this is fine. It's all about learning and figuring out what you're doing. And the great thing with acrylic is you can always paint over it once it dries. So as this is drying, I can go back over and repaint this stuff. So this is that mid cyan color, and I'm just bringing that down into that dark blue. I wasn't sure how I felt about the waterfall, so I'm starting to bring in some of the stuff from the bottom in, and I'm using some of the same colors, and I'm just kind of scrubbing in these shapes, kind of like I did the clouds. And I started with more of a medium blue, and now I'm moving into a lighter blue, just to kind of bring in some of the tops of these. For the water in the base, on the flat part for the water, on the right I'm going to make it smoother like the waterfall is smoother, and on the left I'm going to try and do some of these hard lines like the lines in this waterfall. These are both very different. When I did both of them, towards the bottom of the water, the lines are a bit thicker and they go longer. Towards the top, they're a bit thinner this way, and then also a bit thinner this way, just to show some distance. If they were all the same, it wouldn't kind of go back in space at all. When I did the left side, I tried to keep them all separate, like when I brought lines in, I tried not to paint over it too much. But on the right side, I just kept going until everything was really subtle. I tried to get it a bit lighter towards each waterfall. In hindsight, I wish I would have done like the mist and like the spray of all of the water down here like I did this side. I like this side a lot better, and it was just something I should have probably thought about in hindsight, but I like how it's really irregular in the shapes that it makes, almost like clouds are. On this side, it's all pretty much the same all the way across. And in hindsight, I wish I would have done it differently, but I can always push it a little bit by like making this one a bit taller or this one a bit taller, just to kind of vary that up a little bit. And that's pretty much it for the things I can do. I had toned down a little bit of the lightness at the top of this waterfall, and now I wish I hadn't, so I might bring a little bit more titanium white in. Now, I had said during my practice board that I probably should have started with the darker colors and worked my way to the light colors. So I'm doing that this time, and I have a darker blue. It's mostly cyan with just a touch of white, and I'm going to start layering that in towards the bottom of the waterfall, mixing up a lighter cyan for the next layer, a lighter cyan for the next layer, and keep going all the way until I get to white along the very top. Hello. Kitty cat, there's paint on that. Steven! I need help. Will you take him before he gets in my paint? I have a little bit yet to do on the water, especially here at the bottom of the waterfall, but I can peel up the tape now, and it's the best part about doing the tape. So I'm just going to very carefully grab an edge and peel kind of down and flat against the canvas. I don't want to peel from out here. It's a lot easier if I kind of bring it back on itself like this. And then I check for any areas that bled underneath. And it looks like the white kind of bled a little bit more and the blue didn't quite cover the white that I had put down. So I'll just have to take a little bit of blue and go along the very edge just to kind of hide that little bit of white on the water line. I'm really happy with how the waterfall turned out, but it feels really incomplete to me, and the canvas board didn't feel incomplete, so I wanted to compare them. And if I bring them both here together, you can definitely see that some of these lighter colors in here to make the water a bit more tumultuous with some waves really makes the whole thing come together. So I think I need to lighten this up a little bit around the base of the waterfall. And some of the other things I want to do, I want to add more of this greenery in, maybe even closer to the water. I think on the water line I want to kind of highlight where the water would hit up against some of these rocks, so I might even bring in some light colors there. And then as for the rocks themselves, they just feel incomplete. They need more texture, they need more detail, and they definitely need more contrast. So I'm going to take more of this burnt umber and kind of darken up some of these dark areas, and I'm going to mix up this color again and lighten up some of the light areas. While I'm fixing these rocks, I'm also going to bring a couple of the ones on the shoreline down into the water a little bit. That way it's not just this straight line with rocks behind it. I think it looks a little unnatural that way. So I'm just going to use some of these same colors and maybe like this one here, this tiny little bit of one, and just a couple of these ones in front. I'm just going to bring down into the water just a little bit so there's some depth between there. That way it'll look like the water is going back into the space and some of the rocks are coming forward. We don't have this weird transition line. And in order to do that, I'm just following the line of this rock into the water a little bit, and then it's coming completely horizontal back this way, and then it'll curve back up following the same line of rock. I darkened up the rocks, but not only did I do that, I shaded underneath the greenery a little bit, and I also kind of tried to bring in some texture where I took the dark and kind of brought it more into the highlight edge just to give the rocks some depth and some texture so they don't look like these smooth rocks that are sitting here, so they have a lot more to them. But otherwise, I don't think I'm going to touch any of the mid colors. I'm just going to add a little bit of highlight. So I remixed up this light color that used to be the highlight, added some more white and yellow into it, and I'm just going to be very careful with where I put it. For example, like on this rock, I might just do just a very touch of it like right there and then a little bit maybe over here. I'm not going to put it on every rock, everywhere that's light, just some of them to kind of bring them forward a little bit. And I think it really needs that, because this mountain range has such light colors in it. The waterfall has this pure titanium white and it's super bright, and I have this light color on all the greenery, so I really need to push these rocks too. Water line on each of these rocks is just going to be a very small streak of white, so I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and just very carefully fill that in. I'm also going to bring back some of the mist that had accidentally painted over like when I did this rock, and then we'll move back to adding some more of the greenery. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and if you're satisfied with it here, feel free to stop. If you want to go a little bit further, like you want to push it in a different direction, that's totally fine to do. You could go and add in the foreground and some of the foreground objects from Green Hill Zone. you could do something else. Now, because I've already done the foreground with my Emerald Hill painting from Sonic 2, I think I'm going to put Dr. Robotnik in up here in his little ship that he has for the boss battles. And I'm just going to have him kind of going through the sky because it's a beautiful landscape, it just doesn't feel Sonic-y enough for me. So I'm going to add that in. I'm going to start by drawing it with chalk pastel pencil, doing a base coat with titanium white, and then starting to fill in the details. And we're done! We have the background of Green Hill Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster, or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. And if you painted alongside me today, I'd love to see it, so please tweet me with the hashtag MalMakes. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes. And I'll see you again here for another Intro to Painting.